Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our science seminar today. Today, we're going to learn all about our food choices before we go to lunch. So we'll see how that impacts our lunch. Yes. We have with us Stephen Sturdivant. He's a mechanical engineer. Got his degree from University of North Texas. He is working now out of, is it Region 6? Region 6 of the EPA, the U.S. EPA, out of Dallas. And he's come here to educate us with respect to how we can be more environmentally friendly in our daily lives. We often hear for that from students. There's nothing I can do individually. It's up to the big questions, like who runs the power grid and stuff like that. I have no power over that. But maybe there are some things that we can do individually that do impact our environment. And so Stephen's going to talk to us about that. After the seminar, Stephen has an office hour in the conference room across the hall over there. So if you have further questions about the EPA or other ways that we as individuals or as a community impact our environment, come and talk to Stephen over there in the Glaske Conference Center. What do we call it? Fritz or something? Yeah. I never know how to pronounce that word. Yeah. So I just call it the Glaske Conference Center across from the ties over there. And let's give Stephen a warm welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So the slide is talking about food, and you're an engineer, so you're like, well, what's that all about? Well, I have a mechanical engineering background, and one thing that it taught me was just the skills, the logic process of solving problems, like systems problems. What's one thing we try to do as an engineer? We look at a process, and we see all the steps in that process, and we try to eliminate any unnecessary steps, right? Maximize efficiency. And you can apply that to our food system. In fact, some would argue that our food system is in need of a good update, a good engineering perspective, right? And it takes all kinds of perspectives and backgrounds to, make a sustainable system. So I think I'm talking to the exact correct type of folks here today. Because, that's the approach that I kind of came to the food system, and I hope you will too. The Environmental Protection Agency, it's tasked with protecting human health and the environment. It was born out of a demand by the people who wanted clean air and clean water. And so over the years, it's tried its best to understand the science, and part of what we do is regulatory, part of what we do is non-regulatory, and that's my side of things. I'm a non-regulatory, I'm an educator. I try to provide technical assistance and outreach to help educate people and share best practices, facilitate those discussions so that we can be more efficient with our resources and minimize pollution to our environment, right? So that's the kind of approach that I have to food. I'm going to try to convince you today that food is a priority. It's a priority for the EPA, obviously. That's why I'm here today. And I hope I can convince you today that food is a priority. Now, as you're watching this presentation, please try to consider throughout, is this information actionable? Am I going to take action based on what I'm hearing? So just try to be open to that possibility. Okay. So I want to talk about some of the impacts of our food system and things we can do about it. Let's first talk about the impacts. We've all heard about climate change. Yes, climate change is very important and should be addressed. Another impact that I would say is less talked about is biogeochemical flows, right? Like nutrient pollution. What we're talking about here is water pollution, right? Polluting our rivers. Would you be surprised to learn that the main cause of river pollution is from our food system, right? It's from the farms. What's going on? It's the fertilizer. It's the animal waste. It washes off the farms during rains and floods and can super concentrate in waterways and impact communities downstream, right? It can create toxic algae blooms, where people walking their dogs in this water, these dogs are getting sick. It's robbing the water of oxygen, creating hypoxia, and killing off fish. It's disrupting those ecosystems. Right here we see that it all funnels down into the Gulf and creates this huge ocean dead zone where marine life cannot live. This is impacting these communities. And it's one of America's most widespread and costly environmental challenges that the EPA faces. And it's our food choices that impact this pollution. Okay, let's talk about another impact, land system change. We're talking about deforestation, wetlands reduction. Would you be surprised to learn that food production is the main driver of biodiversity loss, species extinction, habitat destruction? The biggest threat to nature is food production. You know, I come from Dallas, right? It's a big city. All around me, all I see is concrete, buildings, parking lots, highways. And I think that's what's using up all this land. That's what's destroying nature. But if you look at the numbers, the biggest use of land is by far food production. We need land to grow our food. And so our food choices play a critical role in preserving biodiversities and species and habitat. Also, what you're seeing in front of you is carbon, right? Nature is full of carbon. And when we humans go into nature and destroy her, carbon goes up. And when we leave nature alone and give her a chance to heal, carbon returns, biodiversity returns, right? A balance is restored. So we humans play an important role. Okay, the EPA just about a year ago looked at the environmental impacts of just the food we throw away in this country. Let's dive into what those impacts are. We waste about a third of our food in this country, folks. A third. Think about that. Like, that's your grocery bill going down the drain. We don't notice it because it happens bit by bit every day. All right? Over here, let's see, do I have a little clicker thing? There we go. Okay, so look at this loaf of bread. This kind of represents food available to Americans. The white box represents what we eat. The blue is the remaining food waste, more than enough to feed all of America's food insecure households. How do we score as a country, right? Maybe food waste is unavoidable. Well, here it is. Here's America per person per day. This is how much we're wasting. And look how it compares to other countries, even low-income countries that lack the same kind of infrastructure, built out, cold storage and transportation logistics. They're still able to waste far less food than we are. And EPA sees that there's a huge opportunity here. There's a disconnect. When I throw away food, I don't think it's a big deal, right? It turns into dirt. It's good for the earth. Throw it on the earth. It's fine. But now, when I realize what I'm throwing away is not just the food. It's the resources, the land, the water, the fertilizer, and the pollution caused by food production. So now I know that I'm throwing away not just food, but the resources that we all need to share. I'm causing pollution that affects us all. So my choices impact other people's lives. And I want to make good choices. I want to be informed. Right? We're using cropland to grow food to throw away. And that cropland could have been returned to nature. It could have been natural habitat full of carbon, regenerating soils, bringing back biodiversity. Fresh water use. This is a simple thing you all can do. Check this out. Take this number, 151 liters per day, per person. Compare that number to your water bill. You might be surprised to learn that you're throwing away more water in your trash can than your entire household use. As environmentalists, we hear, take shorter showers, don't wash your car, don't water your lawn, reduce the water you use in your homes. This is going to help, right? But let's look at the data. Let's look at the numbers. You might be throwing more water away in your trash can, right? We see the water go down the drain, the shower, the toilet. What we don't see is the water needed to grow our food, to irrigate our croplands. At least a lot of city folks don't make that connection. I know I didn't, right? We also don't see the underground water aquifers that we drill holes into and pump water right out of the ground. And these aquifers are being depleted faster than the rate of recharge. We're measuring this level, just like measuring your gas in your gas tank and seeing it go to empty. That's what's happening to a lot of underground aquifers throughout the United States. This fresh groundwater is a finite resource. We're pulling water out of the ground too fast, an unsustainable rate. We should be sustainable with our resources so that we can have them for generations. Okay, this report looked at a lot of studies here in the United States. You can see 4 studies here, for example. Different studies might have different estimates, different models, but you can get like a general idea from if you look at a bunch of studies, right? So these 4 studies, what do they tell us? We're looking at each color represents a different type of food waste. You can see here fruits and vegetables make up a pretty big chunk of food waste. That makes sense, right? But that's what we see. What do we not see? How about the greenhouse gas emissions from food waste? Right? Remember, greenhouse gas emissions, putting more of it into the atmosphere will cause more warming, and more warming will pull us further away from the stable climate that we've relied on for generations to do things like grow our food, right? Predictable weather. Okay, so let's take, for example, meat, poultry, and eggs. We don't throw away much of it. Good job. But the little that we do throw away represents the biggest share of emissions impact from food waste, right? We want to look for opportunities to minimize emissions. Okay, so what's going on there? Why is that a disparity? Well, it's because different foods have different impacts on the environment, right? It makes sense. Here's 4 studies that looked at the emissions impact of different food choices here in America, right? So we have choices to make. When we throw away food, we throw away fertilizer. A lot of it's going to animal feed. You can see from 3 studies here. And when we throw away food, we throw away land. Cropland. Most of the cropland we throw away is sent to animal feed. In fact, most of the crops we grow here in the United States are not even fed to humans. They're fed to animals, right? Is that an efficient use of our cropland? Now, a lot of studies looked at where food waste is being generated. Where are the opportunities? Let's look at the data. Not what makes us feel good. Let's understand the data. Here we go. You've got farms, manufacturers, retailers, and then restaurants and homes. Big chunk right here, folks. Consumers and consumer-facing businesses. And restaurants, a lot of the food waste is happening at the table, not the kitchen. Right? There's a financial incentive to minimize waste in the kitchen. It does happen, and we're working with them. But there's also at the table, the consumers. Food is cheap in this country, and that's a good thing. But we need to understand the true cost of throwing away food. The cost to the environment, the cost to our health. We have smart food choices we need to make beyond just financial. Okay, also, a lot of waste happening at the farm. Some food is wasted at the farm that's perfectly good to eat. It just sits there and rots, never gets harvested because the farmer can't make enough money to justify packaging it, shipping it, because maybe it doesn't meet the right standards of size, shape, and color. That crooked carrot doesn't sell as much, right? And so a lot of food is wasted. And some would argue that that's consumers as well, right? What do we do when we go to the grocery store? We want to pick out the perfect apple of the bunch, don't we? We don't want that lettuce to have a single bug bite, right? We want our food to look pristine. But now I'm trying to change my habits. I'm trying to embrace the uglies, the imperfections, and learn to love them. Okay, a lot of things we can do. Where is food waste going right now? A lot of it's going to the landfill. And that's making things even worse, folks, because when you pile food waste underneath a bunch of trash, oxygen can't get to it, right? And that creates anaerobic conditions, which cause that carbon to bind to hydrogen, and that creates methane. And methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas. So greenhouse gases are coming up from the landfill, right? So EPA says, please do anything with food waste other than send it to the landfill. Okay, some of it is being donated, rescued, sent to food banks. A lot of churches try to help rescue this food and get it to families in need. This is a good thing. The federal government encourages food donation. The EPA, FDA, and USDA all have said publicly, please, yes, donate. We've even passed federal legislation where you're protected from liability through the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act. If there's a business who you're trying to convince to donate and they tell you, oh, we can't donate food because the federal government doesn't allow us, they are lying to you. They're not telling you the whole truth. Maybe they just don't want to devote an employee staff time to put it aside, find someone to donate it to, and do all those logistics. Okay? Now, what can you do with food waste? Start at the top with prevention. Remember, reduce, reuse, recycle. Apply the same rules to food. Right? We want to prevent food waste before it begins. Now, unfortunately, a lot of businesses will start at the bottom with composting. They'll think, okay, I get it. Food waste, it has an impact. All right, let's do something about it. Let's just compost it. Check that box and call it a day. We're trying to encourage businesses and consumers to first start and exhaust all options at the top first before just going to composting. And there's good reason for that. Let's look at the emissions impact of these different things. Okay, here it is. Landfilling creates additional emissions above the zero line. Look, let's compare that number to composting. You can see composting avoids landfill emissions and sequesters some carbon. But look at source reduction, right? You're avoiding emissions from the entire food supply chain. It's a huge difference. That's why prevention should be preferred. And why is that? Why is source reduction so much better at reducing greenhouse gas emissions than composting? It's because of where the impacts are occurring. Here's the supply chain from farm, distribution, retail, and consumption. Right? A lot of the action is happening at the farm. That's where most of the resources are being spent, right? A lot of the emissions are happening. You know, that's before it even gets on the truck. What do we see? We see the trucks on the road. We see the cars. We think to ourselves, you know what? I'm going to buy local. I'll buy local food from local farms. Surely that would reduce my carbon footprint. Now, there's a lot of really great reasons to buy local. But from an emission standpoint, transportation from farm to retail accounts for only 6% of supply chain energy use. International transportation, only 3% of emissions, right? You're barely scratching the surface when buying local. The data is telling us we need to do more than that. Okay, what are the main sources of emissions from our food system then, if it's not transportation, what I've been told this whole time? Well, the main sources are enteric fermentation from ruminant animals, like cows, through their breathing. It's the emissions from the animal waste itself. You can even smell the gases. And it's nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer application, whether that's to grow food to feed humans or to grow food to feed livestock. Those are the emission sources. Now we know. Now we can make informed decisions. Okay, how do we prevent food waste? We've collected success stories over the years from experts, from businesses. What are they doing to prevent food waste? We're collecting those lessons learned and putting them together in these short little one-pager checklists. It's a long link, but if you email me, I can get it to you. If you have any influence at businesses, give them this one-pager checklist, an easy thing that they can go through to check off to see what they've tried and not tried and what is working. Easy stuff. We also have a guide for at home. People at home, you got to do your part. A lot of food waste is occurring in the fridge. If you can't get to your food in the fridge, throw it in the freezer. Stop that clock. Save that food. Use airtight containers to make your food last longer. You know, if the grocery store is spraying water on the food in the grocery store, maybe you want to put that in your crisper drawer, right? These are simple things that we can do at home. Okay, what else? There's an app for how to keep food fresh longer. Now, if you do have any influence at a business or a school, college, cafeteria, whatever, get them to do a food waste audit, right? You can't tackle it if you don't know what you're throwing away, right? Figure out what you're throwing away and how much. It's easy to do. Take the trash bag, rip it open, go for it. Put it into buckets, weigh the buckets. You got some data. Now you can tackle it. We've even have a guide for kids. Elementary school kids are doing these audits. They're figuring out what they're throwing away, how much, and why. They're actually interviewing their peers, asking them, why are they wasting this food? Why are they not eating it? What's going on there? And getting that valuable data together. Here's just a picture of a little setup, right? Tables and buckets and a clipboard, and you can do a lot of damage. Easy stuff. Okay? If you want to help influence businesses. Now, these are pictures of trash, right? And what do we do as environmentalists when we first look at these pictures? I know what I did. I looked at that plastic. Oh, gosh, look at all that plastic. What can we do? And a lot of businesses will spend a lot of money trying to replace that plastic, find alternative materials like this college. They got rid of every single piece of plastic in their cafeteria. Now they're using reusables, washables. But what did they forget about? The food waste. You know, there's more emissions embodied in the food than the packaging it came in, right? Sometimes these businesses look right over the food as an opportunity to greatly reduce their environmental footprint. Now I see the food, right? I see the food, I see the groundwater depletion, the river pollution, the greenhouse gas emissions, the species extinction, the biodiversity loss, the land use. Now I see the true cost of my food choices. Okay, let's look at some data. If you can, do these food waste audits. This is an example of an elementary school. What are they throwing away? Now they know. They're throwing away a lot of rolls, mashed potatoes, and pizza. Let's look at that. Why is that? Let's look at our mashed potatoes. What can we improve? But what do we not see? The emissions impact of that same data right? Now we're looking at the emissions profile of the food waste, right? Might give you some thoughts on what to focus on. Okay, reasons for loss. You're going to find common reasons. Students are given the same reason over and over again. This is going to help increase student experience, save money, right? This is real data from one audit that we did. And check this out. The stir fry had too much sauce. The head chef had no idea. He was shocked. He told me the very next day he went to his kitchen staff and says, hey, y'all, let's put less sauce on the stir fry. They switched out their spoons. They're saving money on sauce. They're making their students happier, and they're wasting less food. Everybody wins, right? This is helping them increase their profits. Now, one thing I found at school of food waste audits especially was a lot of food was still perfectly good to donate right on the spot, and it was going right in the trash can. Each picture represents one school, one lunch day. And these, we only included in this picture packages that were not even ripped open a little bit. That student just ripped it open a tiny bit. We threw it in the trash can, did not include it in this photo. These are items that are still perfectly good to donate. You could literally just throw them right into a backpack so a kid could take this food home who may not have their third meal of the day, right? Some kids don't have that luxury. Or you can have a share table, or put this in a fridge and have a nonprofit come and pick up this food at the end of the week, right? A lot of schools are doing a lot of great things with this food, but they need to realize how much food potentially they could be feeding families instead of feeding landfills. Okay, let's talk about donation. Here in Dallas, where I'm from, this is a map of Dallas. Every dot represents a feeding charity trying to feed hungry families, right? A lot of these are religious organizations trying to give back to their community. What I was surprised to learn is that they have to buy food from food banks. You know, you hear about those food banks. They're selling food to these nonprofits. And what I found is a lot of them are more than happy to partner directly with the university or grocery store or restaurant to get food for free so that they can devote more of their funds to other social programs, right? Like helping them with job assistance, medical attention, and so on. Right? So make those connections. A lot of times businesses have no idea that there's one of these places right down the street from them. The Dallas Convention Center, their head chef, passionate guy. He would give the shoes off of his feet to a homeless person in the parking lot on his way home. What he didn't realize was they were coming from a homeless shelter right across the highway. And he was throwing away piles of ready-made lunches at the end of every conference because people who would register as an attendee for the conference, some people didn't show up. Let's say 1,000 people register, only 800 show up. That's 200 lunch boxes that was being chunked in the dumpster. But now all I had to do was introduce him to the head chef at the homeless shelter. Get them in the same room together. Get them to shake hands, and in 5 minutes, they were able to come up with a plan to figure out when to pick it up, what door to go to, who to call, and now they're getting all those leftover lunches to this homeless shelter. Okay, one quick thing about date labels. If it's baby food or infant formula, that expiration date label is regulated. But if it's not baby food or infant formula, it is not regulated by the federal government, not at all. It's just a placeholder. A lot of times it communicates to grocery stores, not necessarily communicate with customers. That expiration date label does not necessarily mean food safety date, okay? This is just one example of a food bank and their guide for how long after the expiration date they can still accept food for donation. Some of these numbers is 2 years past the expiration date, depending on the type of food. So keep that in mind. Just because it's expired doesn't necessarily mean it's not safe to eat or nutritious. Okay, let's keep going. You might want to check with your local health department. They may have requirements around food donation, right? I looked at 7 health departments for the Dallas Independent School District, and you can see they definitely have different opinions about what they allow or not allow for food donations. Just call them up, ask them, make sure they're feeling comfortable with it. Or you can talk to a nonprofit who's donating in your city and just do what they do, right? And you can make it work. I can make it work. We were able to find a donation program for the Dallas Independent School District that met the requirements of all 7 cities that their schools were located in. Easy stuff. And I can help you with this. We do have a tool for calculating the greenhouse gas emissions of different types of materials, foods, plastics, different types of foods. You can find out what the emissions impact is and calculate it, so that way you can get that number to your supervisor or decision maker who does have a sustainability goal. A lot of universities, for example, will have emissions reductions targets, and sometimes they're not even looking at their food choices. Okay, how much greenhouse gas emissions are we talking about here? How about 42 coal-fired power plants? That's a lot, folks. That's a lot of emissions that we could avoid just by reducing food waste. And it's enough fertilizer to grow all plant-based foods for U.S. human consumption. That's how much fertilizer we waste. And it's enough land to cover California and New York combined. That's just here in the United States. Imagine that. Imagine if we stopped wasting food today. We could free up this much land. Imagine that land returning to nature, rewilding, sequestering carbon, regenerating the soils, just by leaving Mother Nature alone and letting her do her thing. That would be incredible. And it ends up being a whole lot of carbon. Okay, let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about fossil fuels, because I always hear about fossil fuels and climate change. Well, this is one of the findings of our report. Even if fossil fuel emissions were immediately halted, right? We stopped burning fossil fuels today. Is that going to solve climate change? Well, not anymore. We've burned so much already that we now have to address food system emissions if we want to beat this thing. We now have to address food system emissions as well as fossil fuels. That's how late in the game we are. We're at pencils down time, right? So how do we reduce emissions from the food sector? Well, many of the studies presented in this report compared a variety of strategies, including farming practices, dietary shifts, and reducing food loss and waste, finding that only in combination could we achieve a sustainable agricultural future. So if we want a sustainable agricultural future, what the data is saying is that we need to do all three. We have to change our farming practices. We have to change our diets. And we have to reduce food waste. And we have to do them all together. We can't just do one of them. We can't just wait on farms to fix this for us. They need our help. They need us to do our part as well. Okay, and among food categories, animal products require the most land, water, fertilizer, and energy, and emit the most greenhouse gases per unit of food compared to plant-based food alternatives. That's what we found. Here's what it looks like visually, right? I'll walk you through this. This big black bar represents the emissions from our food system alone projected out into the future. You can see very plainly our food system alone is going to burn through the remaining budget we have left at staying below 1.5 degrees of warming, which the international scientific community has come to consensus on as saying we need to try to stay under that target if we want to enjoy the stable climate that we've been enjoying. So here are the strategies to reduce those emissions. Plant-rich diets, for example, right? Eat more plant-based foods, fewer animal-based foods. That can give us the emissions reductions we need to get to 1.5 all by itself. Other strategies, healthy calories. We've got farming practices and reducing food waste. And if we do them in combination, now we can get the serious emissions reductions we need. Not the ones that make us feel good, but the ones we actually need if we want to beat climate change. Now we know. Now we're informed. And when we know better, we can do better. Okay, there we go. I also want to encourage you to take a picture of this slide because you can email me directly, ask more questions. I'm an educator, and I want us to learn from each other, so please reach out if you have any follow-up questions. And also, I want to take this moment to answer any questions you may have immediately. Yeah.
So when you were talking about meat production, one thing that you said was a really big contributor to their carbon footprint was the fact that they were also taking up farmland from the things that were produced for their feed. Did you look at just grain-finished or corn-finished cattle, or did you also compare grass-fed cattle? Because grass-fed cattle do produce 20% more carbon from just like the fact that they're eating grass, but then they're also not eating grain, so they're taking up less farmlands. They're not using nitrogen fertilizer because they're just eating the grass. And I'm not talking about grass-fed grain-finished, just purely grass-fed cattle.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's what life cycle analysis tries to do. A lot of times when you're comparing choices, there's pros and cons, right? We see this, like electric cars. There's There's pros and cons to that, right? The battery, you hear about the lithium battery. That is a con, right? But not using gas is a pro, right? So where does it balance out? And life cycle analysis tries to do that. It tries to compare two options, see the pros and cons, weigh them out, measure them, like emissions impact, for example, and see where it ends up in the end, right? And they do a really good job at trying to factor in everything, right? That's what life cycle assessment is. And then you have a lot of studies that you can look into that are peer-reviewed in scientific journals, and then meta-analyses, which are analyses of analyses. So that gives you an even better idea of, how to compare these options. So these studies do look at that. They look at different farming practices, like grass-fed versus grass-fed grain-finished. And what they're finding is that grass-finished actually does create more greenhouse gas emissions. So you were correct. The reason for that is because, number one, they use more land, right? They use more land. Also, the way they digest grass compared to grain is different for emissions impact. And it takes them longer to reach slaughter weight, so like per pound of meat, right? It's creating more greenhouse gases per pound. So those are the, yeah?
But grass-fed beef is 30% more nutrient dense than non-grass-fed beef. So even like if they're not reaching slaughter weight, individuals have to eat less grass-fed meat in comparison to what they would have to eat for grain-finished meat. So if you're comparing to that, do they end up having about the same emissions?
So a lot of these, good question, a lot of these meta-analyses, and that was a really important question, and you should discriminate these studies so that we can make better studies in the future. And at first, a lot of these studies that looked at comparing emissions impact of different food choices, they were comparing them per pound, per kilogram, right? But now people think, you know what, we choose food because of the nutrients, so let's measure that. So a lot of these newer studies, these meta-analyses are looking at comparing these food choices by calorie, by gram of protein, and other nutrients. And what they're finding is, and just like what our report found, is that animal products in general, especially beef, of any type, creates far more greenhouse gas emissions per unit of protein or calorie or pound compared to plant-based alternatives. And grass-fed is still more carbon intensive. Now, there's different types of grass-fed, right? There's different types of farming production, right? And these studies look at an average. What is available to you in the grocery store on average? What can you scale and meet current demands, right, but for consumers? If you go into the grocery store, what are your choices? And these studies try to make that as clear as possible so that you can actually use these studies in the decisions that you make in your daily life. So different farms definitely have a range, right? But you can do averages, and that's what they're showing in these meta-analyses on average. Yes?
Just a quick question. Do you guys have any, this totally, you didn't even mention this, but do you guys have any data on like hunting and stuff like that? I saw fish was, you had a little sliver for fish on that large bar graph, but like fishing and hunting, is there any data on how much carbon that those produce?
That's a good question. I haven't seen too many studies that looked at, hunted animals specifically compared to farm raised. I would imagine that maybe the environmental impact would be less. That's my guess. A lot of these studies are also factoring scalability. Can we meet demand? Even with grass-fed, if we switch to entirely, and there's pros and cons to grass-fed. Let me just clarify that. I was just talking about emissions impact, right? There are other pros and cons, to different production methods. Is it scalable? So for grass-fed, for example, is not able. If we transition to all organic or all grass-fed, there's no way we can meet current demands. So what all of these studies are showing, no matter what the production method, a reduction in meat consumption is required in order to meet climate goals, no matter how we produce it. So what they're showing is that a lot of times what's more important is what you buy, not where it's from or how it was produced. That has to play a critical role. The reduction is key. It's just the scale is so huge. We have a question here.
One thing that you mentioned very briefly in answering that question as an incidental is that beef is especially problematic. It seems to me it's not very realistic to expect that most Americans will adopt a plant-based diet. It does seem somewhat more realistic that you could migrate them from one category of meat to another. How dramatic is the difference between different categories of animal-based foods?
It's huge.
Yeah.
It's a huge range. Now, if you compare animal-based foods to plant-based foods are definitely by many magnitudes of order far better. But among animal products, there's also a very wide range. There's a really, beef alone you see the bar and it just goes on and on, So there's definitely a lot of variability there. And I showed some of those, some of those estimates on average
Yes.
in the previous slide. And so, right, some environmentalists, they want to go all the way, right? I have a friend, she's zero waste. She puts all of her waste in a jar, and she puts it on Instagram, and, we're proud of her. She's amazing. She makes all of her own clothes. She homesteads. She's way above me, right, in a lot of ways. I can't be zero waste. I tried. Some people give up their cars. If you recommend to someone, hey, if you gave up your car, that'd be great for the environment. Some people would just, run in terror hearing about the possibility of giving up their car. That's just impossible. I got to get my kids to school. I got to get them to the bus, and I got to drive an hour to work. There's no way I can get on that train and make it work for my life. Sometimes the option is not there for you. There's some communities that don't even have access to a grocery store, right? But for those that regularly shop at grocery stores, those that have the ability and choice, the advice is the same for whether or not you want to drive less or recycle. Just do what you can. Go as far as you can. That's practical and possible for you. And if we all try and care about how we impact the world, maybe we can reduce the harm that we cause if we all do what we can. And this is just another way, another option available to us. Some people can't afford electric cars or solar panels, but maybe they can afford to, save money at the grocery store. Okay, I think she had a question.
So if you actually did a significant switch from meat-based diet to plant-based diet, then you would have to gear up the plant growth to meet that. And I know in a lot of times beef can be grown in areas where you would have to do extensive water transport in order to raise the plants, or plants sometimes have more restrictive region where they can be grown. So I know there's different aquaponics and indoor growing accelerator type environments you could build for food, but they're still very artificial, where you're going to have more electricity in order to keep their temperature range where it could grow. I guess when I hear reduce your meat diet, then you're going to have to get your calorie. You're going to have to up that fruit and vegetable, which tends to have a lot of waste because it gets bruised or doesn't, meet some kind of requirement. It's being thrown away on the farm. So I guess what do you see as far as realistic if we did this anytime in the near future? Where would we go to grow all that extra fruit and vegetable that it would require?
Good question. So again, we see a pro and con, right? If you eat more fruits and vegetables, you're going to create, we're going to need land to grow those extra fruits and vegetables. So it's a pro and con, right? That's what these life cycle assessments do. They look at the options. How much land does this diet or lifestyle require in resources, and how much does this diet, land, or lifestyle require? Now, your cropland would bump up in the fruits and vegetables category. But what we're doing here in the United States, most of the cropland, the arable cropland, right, the one that gets a lot of rainfall, most of that is fed to animals. Some studies are showing that a transition to plant-based diet could reduce the cropland required by 50%. That's factoring in the slight bump up of fruits and vegetables. But you're greatly reducing another bump from the animal feed, like the corn and the soy that you're growing on cropland. That could be growing calories for humans, right? So you factor in both of those, and you see where the line ends up. And that's what these studies are trying to do. But she had a couple other points I wanted to mention. Food waste, fruits and vegetable waste will go up. You're right about that. And so let's look at that data. I have a slide on that one. I don't know if I can go back pretty quickly. Well, let's try this. Okay, there you go. So let's look at this picture, right? So even today, with our current diets, fruits and vegetable waste make up the biggest chunk, right? That's the dark blue. But the emissions impact is different, right? We already throw a lot less meat, poultry, and eggs than we do fruits and vegetables, but they make up a bigger share of emissions. So if we were to say, for example, transition to a plant-based diet, they looked at that, and they said that the emissions impact of our food waste would also go down because different foods have different impacts. Some studies are showing that the opportunity food loss inherent in growing crops like corn and soy to feed animals instead of growing crops to feed humans, that waste is actually greater than direct food waste. It's greater than the food waste we actually throw away. If you think of it from an opportunity cost, right? You've got a bunch of land, you need to feed a bunch of people. How many people can you feed with this land? What's the most efficient way to do that? And there are marginal lands, like you mentioned, different types of land. But they're showing that a plant-based diet can reduce cropland by 50%, the arable land, the good land that you have a lot of options for. And the marginal lands is just not enough to meet current demands for beef consumption. It's just, you have to keep in mind how much beef we produce in this country, how much we eat per day, how that has changed in just 20 years. Here in America, our culture 20 years ago, we had a whole different relationship with the way we eat than we do today. Okay, and then I think you had a question, and then we'll go to her.
I'm kind of curious, with your LCA models, have you taken into account the phosphorus deficit that we're probably going to be seeing in a really short period of time?
Yes. Yeah, good question. There's a lot of different environmental impacts, not just emissions. And so what does the data show? And it shows that among food categories, animal products require the most land, water, and fertilizer. So that's your nitrogen, your phosphorus, right? Apparently, you've got to fertilize corn in the animal feed. You've got to fertilize the soy. Now, if you just use marginal land, we're not going to be able to meet the levels of beef consumption that we have here in this country. We would still have to reduce our beef consumption. But like the little that we do eat, yes, let's try to find the most sustainable farming practices for the little that we do eat. But all these studies are showing a reduction is necessary if we want to have a sustainable agricultural future. We're still going to have to reduce our consumption, right? That's what these studies are showing. There's still the two biggest things you can do with our food system. Farming practices are important and critical, and we have that in our report. But the two biggest things you can do as a consumer is to reduce food waste and change your diet. Those are the biggest and necessary things. And then with the little, indulgences that we want to have, then we can focus on farming practices. But let's not let that distract us from the really big solutions that we have in front of us, like buying local or composting. Some people only buy local and compost, and they think that they're living sustainably. And what the data shows is that we need to do more if we want to tackle climate change. And then...
I don't think you really answered my question.
Sorry. Okay, tell me again.
Yeah, so we already know we pull nitrogen out of the air.
Right.
We convert it to ammonia, nitrates. But the other big limiting nutrient is phosphorus, which is mined. And these are reserves that are dwindling very, very fast. And just recent reports are indicating that we're going to probably be out of it, within the next decade or two.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious, with these models, you could definitely play some scenarios. How could I basically keep this phosphorus around the longest possible way? And then how does that impact then your greenhouse gases, and other things?
Right.
Because if you can't grow crops, obviously, because you don't have enough phosphorus, a lot of this becomes a moot point.
So some things you can do is more targeted fertilizer application. Some farms, they just put like a lot of fertilizer on the fields. And the USDA and others are trying to help farmers and incentivize them to do more targeted timings of fertilizer application. Fertilizer meaning phosphorus and nitrogen. I think one way we can tackle it is to not squander it, right? To make food choices that require less phosphorus and nitrogen to grow our food, right? And so when you're having to put nitrogen and phosphorus on crops to feed animals and then eat those animals, there's an efficiency loss, right? That's what we learn in engineering, is that there's always a cost at every step, an energy in and energy out, right? Energy and work. And so there's going to be an efficiency loss. And so when you grow and fertilize with nitrogen and phosphorus crops to feed animals, you're going to get fewer calories and protein out than if you were to just put that same nitrogen and phosphorus on crops to grow for direct human consumption. That's one idea, one option that people may have, right? And that's what our report found, is that animal products, require more fertilizer. Yeah.
So I guess.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I wanted to get to you. You had your hand up. And let me get to you then. I want to try to help respect everyone.
So how would you balance a diet? Because a lot of people eat more fruits and vegetables but still have to add in certain irons and other. And how would you also factor fish and balancing that? Because you could use fish as a more sustainable food product. Is it less carbon emissions? But you also, there are a lot of rules and regulations on how much people can fish to refrain from overfishing. So how would you balance the land so that we don't overwork our land other than crop rotating and with less meat options available increase in farmers?
So what she's doing right now is a life cycle assessment, right? She's considering options. She's thinking of additional options. And that's beautiful. If I could just have y'all do that, just be thinking about your options and think about it objectively. I do have options. What are my options? What are those impacts? That would be a huge success of this presentation, if you could just start thinking about that. So you mentioned fish. A lot of these meta-analyses do look at fish, the emissions impact, the land use, and so on. Farm fish definitely require feed, just like a lot of livestock. Fishing in the oceans can impact other countries and their ability to fish in oceans. You see some of these fishers, these subsistence communities are having trouble getting the same amounts of fish out of the ocean because these big commercial ships are now competing with them, right? And can we pull more fish out of the ocean at a sustainable rate? We need to look at that. We need to look at how sustainable our fisheries are today. And if we can increase demand safely, what are our options? You mentioned about diet, right? And going back to my friend who has the jar, some people may want to go all the way. Some people want to just kind of reduce a little bit. Maybe they can get rid of their car and do this and maybe fly less, or no, I have to fly. There's a lot of things you can do. And again, just try to do what you can. Go as far as you can. If you want to be completely plant-based, I know a lot of y'all jar people out there, environmentalist diehards, want to go all the way. You can, if appropriately planned. You do have to plan your diet. You do need to make sure you have a well-balanced diet. I would argue that most Americans don't even have a well-balanced diet today. So just looking at your diet would be a huge step for a lot of Americans. If you want to be completely plant-based, you can, but you will have to do your homework. Talk to a dietitian. A lot of dietitians have free resources online on their websites. Just make sure that the resource you're looking at is from a licensed dietitian, and they have really great, fully plant-based dietary plans that are reasonable and you can follow. Just do your homework. Okay, and then we had her, and then I'm going to go to you next.
Okay, so I guess I didn't get my point across very well when I was mentioning the grass-fed cows earlier. So for 4 ounces of grass-fed beef, you have 24 grams of protein. And then for 4 ounces of pasture-raised chicken, you actually have 26 grams of protein. And I know that my parents, they raise chickens on a small scale, and they don't really use feed. They just feed them our leftover food scraps. So we're able to recycle food that way. And then when you have the grass-fed cows that are not grain-finished, so I'm not talking about grass-fed grain-finished, just purely grass-fed, you're no longer diverting all of that farmland that was producing the grains for the cows. For the meat production, you can use that farmland specifically for just grain and produce production for people. Because if you look at grass-fed cows, they take up less pasture overall, even though they need a little bit more pasture to eat the grass, and it takes longer to get them to weight. Because you have about 10 milligrams of protein per 4 ounces, people are having to eat less of it to get nutrients and to get iron.
Yeah, and before everybody leaves, what she's doing is a life cycle assessment as well. No, she's bringing up some good points, and I want her to finish. She's bringing up a whole bunch of different points, and these are all should be factored into a good life cycle assessment, right? And that's why they're peer reviewed, so that other peers in the scientific community that do this type of research make sure that they think about all of those factors, right? There's a really one, for example, a really good meta-analysis. It's one of the most comprehensive meta-analysis that I've been able to find to date. Looked at tens of thousands of farms. It's out of Oxford. It's called Reducing Food's Impact Through Producers and Consumers. They looked at tens of thousands of farms, many different production methods. And you can see how they compare per gram of protein, right? There's going to be pros and cons. Like pasture raised, they don't use any crop land, but they use more pasture land, right? And you should have to factor that in. How much land are you using? What could that land be doing instead? What are the options? If you freed up that land, let it return to natural grasslands, that's a carbon benefit as well. So you have some pros and cons with grass finish.
But like with chickens and rabbits, a lot of times they're able to be pasture raised inside a garden. Because I know chickens won't actually eat a lot of produce vegetables. They want to eat your garden. So then you're fertilizing your garden from the chickens, and then chickens actually have more protein than beef when pasture raised. So you're getting a lot of protein from the chicken.
Right.
So I feel like maybe instead of just going plant-based, we should look towards a model that works to have like amount of proteins that can be grown well with our plants. Because like with iron, you're getting different types of iron from plants than you would be getting from protein. So a lot of people could end up having an iron deficiency if they're getting their iron solely.
That's why you need to appropriately plan. That's important. You can get iron from a plant-based diet, but you need to make sure to know what types of plant foods you need to be eating. But yeah, iron is a nutrient of concern if you are going to be completely vegan. You just need to find plant-based foods that have iron, and you can get enough iron. But again, you look at these studies. Do this type of analysis yourself and just look at the data. There are better production methods of creating meats, chickens, and beef compared to others. But also think about scalability. Is this practical for everyone? Can we do this without reducing our meat consumption? And what these meta-analyses are doing, some of them take close to a decade to complete. Decades of data that they're pulling from farms, different production methods. They all are in agreement that a reduction of meat consumption will be needed. We can't just farm our way out of this. We've got to do all three.
And
right?
we're all in agreement that we can take this discussion and continue it over there across the street in the conference center. So until next time, let's thank our speaker one more time. If you got more questions, then come on down to the front. Okay.